Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Global Chess League. We have one of the greatest matches, or rather, one of the greatest rivalries there ever were in chess. There is Magnus Carlsen versus Viswanathan Anand. At the moment, they are both former FIDE Classical champions. Even though this is a rapid game, this is their first encounter, as both have lost their FIDE Classical title. But Magnus is still the World Rapid champion. So there's that, and he won the World Rapid Championship 4 times. Anand also won the World Rapid Championship. He won it twice in 2017 and also in 2003, already 20 years ago. He defeated Vladimir Kramnik in the finals. I mean, of course, it will be an incredible fight, one could imagine. In the interview after the game, they asked the players, how do they still feel about playing each other? And they said that they played so many games after their World Chess Championship match that it's not as special to them as it is to the audience. But I'm sure you guys are always excited when Magnus is playing Anand, and I am as well. So let's check it out. Magnus has the white pieces, and he plays pawn to c4. He goes for the English opening, pawn to c5, and the g3. Probably planning to go for some sort of a symmetrical setup. Knight to c6 with bishop to g2 and pawn to g6. Anand also preparing to fianchetto his dark square bishop. Knight to c3 and bishop to g7, the so-called ultra-symmetrical line. d3 we have d6, and now there are some games where e3 was played, also knight to h3 is a known move, but here we have queen to d2 by Magnus, and it is now as of move 6 that we have a completely new game. So okay, Anand continues development, knight to f6, we have b3, now preparing to fianchetto the other bishop as well, castles and bishop to b2. And while this is all very nice, and you're probably wondering why doesn't everyone just do this every game, I mean, aren't the bishops best deployed on the longest diagonals possible? Yes, but it's often very easy to counter them. So here bishop to d7, knight to f3, and now rook to b8, preparing to push that pawn to b5. We have castles and of course a6, preparing pawn to b5. We have knight to d5 by Magnus, now putting pressure on f6, also opening up his dark square bishop. And here Anand played pawn to e6. Later in an interview after the game, he said that it was a sort of a weird moment for him, because he wanted to play e5. He knew that e5 was probably best. It closes the position, and not a lot to hope for here. Doesn't look like much for either of them. Let's say if something like e3, you can play b5 and so on and so on, but it's not very interesting. So instead he played pawn to e6, which aims to trade off a lot of pieces, and then perhaps later on advance the pawn to d5 or e5. So okay, knight captures on f6, check by Magnus with bishop captures, and now pawn to d4. Later in an interview after the game, Magnus said that this pawn to d4 was a key move for him to play, because if Anand played pawn to e5 instead of pawn to e6, d4 would not be possible. So okay, pawn to b5, and now Magnus plays d captures on c5, bishop captures on b2, queen captures, and of course d captures on c5. And now you might be thinking, well, Magnus, of course, played c captures on b5. We have a captures on b5 and rook f to c1. And now this, would or should be a weak backwards pawn, because you can never play c4, but it's not, because the queen is on the same file as the rook, and Anand uses this to his advantage. He plays pawn to c4, b captures, now opens an attack towards Magnus's queen, but just queen to c3. And now, as you can see, it is impossible to defend the c4 pawn, so Magnus will win it. So pawn to e5, with ideas that if Magnus goes after the e5 pawn instead of the c4 pawn, then Anand will get his rook to e8, go after the e2 pawn, get even more activity. So Magnus simply captures the c4 pawn, and now queen to e7. We have pawn to h4 and rook f to c8. Nicely deploying the rooks on the C and B file. Now some maybe nasty discoveries will be possible, but Magnus just moves the queen. You could trade queens right away with queen to c5, but Magnus feels that the queen has more use than just trading her for the black queen. So you stop pawn to e4, but Anand will of course not allow that. He plays bishop to f5, kicks away Magnus's queen, queen to e3, and now pawn to e4. Attacks the knight, knight to g5, and now knight to b4. There is no way to defend the pawn, and Anand knows it. We have rook captures on c8. Here, okay, if you go after the pawn right away, then Anand's plan was rook captures, and then maybe the knight can pick off the a2 pawn, but Magnus just captures it, rook captures on c8 with check, rook captures, and bishop captures on e4 now. So what was Anand's real plan with knight to b4? Well, it was knight to c2, attacking the queen and the rook, and now Magnus has to go for this endgame, which is better for him. It's only merely a matter of how much better. So bishop captures on c2, queen captures on e3, we have f captures, and rook captures on c2. Now Magnus is up 2 pawns, but Anand's position is very active. He has a bishop against a knight. The rook is already on the second rank. This will be very, very hard to win. Magnus plays king to f1, defends the pawn, and now just bishop to c8. Now he wants to play bishop to a6 and go after this e2 pawn. And remember after that game 5 where Magnus Carlsen defeated Viswanathan Anand in their 2013 World Chess Championship match, they asked Garry Kasparov about his thoughts after the game, and he said that famous saying that, in the end game, the gods have placed Carlsen. So are the gods, do the gods still favor Magnus? Let's check out how the game went. We have knight to f3. And now bishop to a6, of course going after the e2 pawn, but now just knight to d4. And now you don't have to worry about the e2 pawn. The knight is nicely defending the e2 pawn, and of course the knight is on a dark square, so you can never kick it away. You only have a rook and a light square bishop. So rook to c3, Anand also very nicely uses his rook. He attacks the e3 pawn, so Magnus has to defend the pawn, and then he will shift the rook over to a3 and prevent Magnus from advancing his a pawn. So king f2, and of course rook to a3. Now with ideas of bishop c4 and winning that a2 pawn. And now, okay, Magnus would still be up 1 pawn, but it would be a double e pawn, and that would be a draw. So knight to c2 attacks the rook. We have rook to a4, and now pawn to a3. It's on a dark square, so it's very safe. Magnus now has to figure out how to kick the rook away from a4. Some moves with the knight, put the knight on b2, kick away the rook, and then advance the pawn to a4 and a5, and so on, and repeat that until the pawn reaches a8. So here we have bishop to b7. And knight to b4. We have king to g7. Here you could also consider a bishop to e4. It prevents the knight from going to c2, but if you play something like knight to d3, for example, going for knight to c5 to attack the bishop and the rook, let's say rook to a5, you could play a4. It's not a problem. And then if the bishop attacks the pawn, then you go back knight to b2. And then you figure out a way. I'll probably just use the dark squares, get the king all the way to b4, kick away the rook, and play a5, a6, and so on. So after knight to b4, Anand instead decided to activate the king. King to g7 was played, and now knight to d3. We have rook to a5 and rook to b1. Now, you were probably expecting pawn to a4, but Magnus has a different plan. Attacks the bishop here, and now bishop to d5. Probably the plan was if a bishop to e4, let's say, then he could play rook to b4, and maybe if Anand tried to win a pawn here, let's say bishop captures, e captures, and rook captures on a3, then Magnus plays d4, he undoubled his pawns, and now the d4 pawn is extremely strong. But Anand doesn't go for bishop to e4, he plays bishop to d5, and now just rook back to a1. So probably his plan didn't work out. We have bishop to e4 now, and knight to b2. Now preparing pawn to a4, and now king to h6. We have knight to c4, kicks away the rook, rook to a6, and pawn to a4. So you want to have your knight ready to advance the pawn all the way to a5. Again, if you play bishop to d5, then just knight back to b2, and now rook a5. You do stop the pawn, but it's a fairly similar position, and you might even run into some e4 moves. For example, pawn to e4, and I have bishop captures on e4, knight to c4. Also, you win some squares. Okay, you get rid of your passed pawn, not passed pawn, doubled pawn, but you get rid of the rook. You play a5, a6, and so on. And also, you could try just bringing the king into the game. Also, could be very nice. But instead, after a4, Anand played king to h5, and now we have knight to d2. Attacks the bishop, and now rook to f6 with check. Again, if you repeat with knight to d5, it's the same thing. Pawn to a5, and now if pawn to f5, stopping pawn to e4, you will go knight to f3, and then the knight again will find its way over to the pawn. For example, if king to h6, knight to d4 will happen. If king g7, knight to c2, and then of course if bishop to e4, knight to b4 kicks away the rook, rook to a7, and then again the king comes into the game via the dark squares. Pawn will come to a6, a7. And so on. Of course, a6, then the knight will somehow kick away the rook, or the king might come all the way to b6, kick away the rook, and then we advance the pawn to a7, which is a dark square, and then, well, good things will happen. So instead, after knight d2, we have rook to f6, check by Vishy, knight to f3, and now king to g4. And here, Magnus played pawn to a5, and he was in this position on move 44 that Viswanathan Anand resigned the game, as there seems to be nothing more to be done here. So it could be a bit premature. Anand had over a minute on the clock. Magnus had over 2 minutes. But I mean, if a former world champion, former world class and former world rapid champion decides that it's time to call it a day, then you, well, one tends to believe him. And of course, you can. If you want to check for sure, you cannot, because chess has only been solved for up to 7 pieces on the board, which means, and in this case, a piece is, yes, a rook, a pawn, and the king. Those are all pieces. And here you have, that's 4, that's 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. 14 pieces. Chess, it's going to be a very long time before we solve chess for up to 14 pieces on the board. I've read somewhere that they are currently solving chess for up to 8 pieces on the board, but I mean, no one can even guess when that will be. But up to 7 pieces, yes, it has been solved. So you know, we cannot know for sure, but we can ask our good friend the engine, and this, yes, of course, is winning. The problem is, how are you stopping the pawn? If you play something like rook to a6, okay, you've stopped the pawn, but then knight g5 attacks both of the pawns, attacks the bishop, and I mean, you're going to lose another pawn, and then it's very much winning. And the other thing is that if you don't, okay, you could maybe let the pawn come to a6, but then you, what are you going to play? You play king to f5, then we play pawn to a6, then rook to b6, pawn to a7, and then bishop to a8, the only way to stop the pawn from queening. But now again, knight g5, and you will lose more pawns and then the game. If you try something like f6, sort of a trick to take away the g5 square from the knight and maybe try to win the knight later on, let's say knight captures on h7, rook b7, it will not work because there's rook to a5 with check. And now the king either moves away and then knight captures and f6 happens, or you try to save the pawn and then rook a6 check again will win the f6 pawn, because now the rook also guards the knight. So that's a problem. So a5 is okay, it could look maybe a bit premature because Anand had more time on the clock, but like I said, if Anand resigns, then you can be sure it is not premature. So yeah, very nicely done by Magnus. Like I said, their first game, as both of them now are former world classical champions, so you know, there is some significance to that, I believe. So hope you enjoyed that. I would like to thank Brian Baker, bulletchessthriller.com, Samuel Kane, Dan McCormick, and James Eugene Cashman for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day. And yes, I have I forgot to show you the standings. So here are the standings, not the standings, but the results of the big clash between these 2 teams. There you have it. Even though Magnus defeated Anand on board 1, his team, the Alpine Warriors, have lost the game to Ganges Grandmasters, as Rapport defeated Gukash on board 2, and Kotanishvili defeated Pets on board 5. So there we have it. Very nicely done by Anand's team. You know, he lost, but his team won. So, you know, there's also that. See you soon. Have an excellent rest of your day. Enjoy.